Good afternoon and good morning. My name is Steve Kelly. I'm the Chief Trust Officer at the Institute for Security and Technology. We are a nonprofit, a 501c3 think tank, building bridges between technologists and policymakers to tackle emerging security problems. I'm really happy to welcome you to our webinar today on our latest bit of artificial intelligence work. Back in December 2023, IST published a report called "How Does Access Impact Risk? Assessing AI Foundation Models Risk Along a Gradient of Access." And we're here today to launch and talk about our latest piece of work, which takes the next step from that. Our report today is called a Lifecycle Approach to AI Risk Reduction, in which we tackle the risk of malicious use amid the implications of openness. Malicious use is one of the 7 categories of risk that we identified in our last report, and we're pleased to be able to do a deep dive on malicious use and propose an approach for managing that risk. So I'd like to introduce today Mariami Tkeshelashvili. She is the new Senior Associate for Artificial Intelligence Security Risk, and also Louie Kangeter from the team at IST. He is the principal author of this report. Mariami is going to lead our panel of experts as we talk about this report. What does it say? What does it mean? And what are the implications, with a number of stakeholders from across the technology and the academic environment. So very much look forward to this conversation, and thank you all for joining. So Mariami, over to you.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Steve. And I want to thank our speakers for being with us today. They are all kind of great representatives from the industry, from the academia, from the think tank environment. So thank you all for being with us today. I will introduce our panel speakers, and then I will hand it over to Louie to introduce the paper, the findings of the report, on like high-level findings of the report and some of the recommendations that we issued. So I would like to welcome Valerie Wirtschafter, who is a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy and AI and Emerging Tech Initiative at Brookings. Her research falls into 2 thematic areas. One is democratic resilience and democratic erosion, and the second one is AI, technology, and the information space. Using a data-driven approach, her work has helped to reframe discussions around underexplored media and novel challenges to the information space, provided new tools and methods for academic and policy research, and reshaped policy at leading tech companies. Valerie also oversees the adoption of data science methods and emerging technologies across Brookings. And in this capacity, she co-leads the development of Brookings' recently adopted provisional principles for the use of generative AI, which is an innovative piece of work that is helping to set the standards for the use of generative AI across the think tank space. Next, I want to welcome Duncan Eddy, who is a research fellow in the Stanford University Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics. He completed his PhD in aerospace engineering from Stanford, funded by the National Defense Science and Engineering Graduate Fellowship. His current research focuses on decision-making in safety-critical climate and space systems, where the operational decisions must be made safely and correctly while still being explainable and usable by human stakeholders. He's currently executive director of the Stanford Center for AI Safety and a postdoctoral researcher with appointments in the Mineral X and the Stanford Intelligent Systems Laboratory. And I will also like to welcome kind of a special panel speaker we have joining us from Ukraine, Andrew Bevz, who is joining us from Osavul. Also is a tech company focused on countering disinformation, mostly Russian-born disinformation and cyber ops, and it provides software solution to the disinformation threats, assess system, and counter and kind of comes up with the malicious countermeasures. He's passionate about utilizing innovative technologies and marketing strategies to drive awareness and adoption of cutting-edge AI-driven technologies. Thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to a fruitful and very interesting discussion, not only about the report that we're launching today, but generally about AI risks, and especially around your own expertise in the AI safety and AI security space. Louie, over to you.
Thank you, Mariami. So I am proud to announce and launch this paper today. As Steve mentioned, the lifecycle approach to AI risk reduction is the next step in our research surrounding AI, specifically around some of the questions around openness. To provide a little bit of background about this paper and then to jump into what we've accomplished today, I'd like to go back to the December report where we did some work on the specific risk categories that are most challenging when openness and the gradient of openness is accessed by more and more models. So one of the things that we found in that report that is carried over into the research that we've done to date is that the upstream and downstream approach to mitigating risks, really targeting those risk mitigations to the most important points, is crucial to dealing with some of the risks that come from and are associated with openness. And that was really the driving factor behind the work that we've done to date. So to introduce the paper and a little bit of the background on how we got to where we are, after our December report, we built on what we learned with the working group and conducted a series of interviews with the working group members, experts from all over the field in private industry, other experts in the think tank space, and folks from the policy space, and heard that consistently, while policymakers want to find risk mitigations for risky technologies, especially in the AI space, there's a lack of shared principles around AI regulation and AI risk mitigation, which makes it difficult to determine what a good risk mitigation would be. So the working group members highlighted that lack of shared principles, and they also highlighted the importance of the life cycle framework, which became the core risk mitigation framework for this report. And the goal of this framework really is to come up with risk mitigations and build a framework to target risk mitigations in the most effective way possible without unintended side effects. So the way I've always kind of thought about it is if you break a leg and you go to your doctor and your doctor says, we're going to give you some medication to help your leg heal. It's great if the medication does nothing but make your leg heal. You don't want the medication to make a finger fall off or to make your ear fall off. So what we really want to do when we're building risk mitigations is target them in the most specific and effective way possible so that we can get the most out of the back end. We can reduce and mitigate risk as much as possible without having unintended side effects. So to jump into the report, obviously we have our introduction to the report where we talk about the key principles that we're focused on and the goals of the report. And that leads us into those high level shared principles, the guiding principles, which our working group members emphasize as being really crucially important to build a high level risk framework that can address both closed, open, and models that fall anywhere on that gradient of access. So those guiding principles include balancing innovation and risk aversion. So fostering innovation and growth that's inherent to the open access ecosystem while also managing risks associated with it. Another one of our guiding principles is shared responsibility, which really simply means that this space is too big for any one part of the field to make the decisions on how to mitigate risk. And in order for effective risk mitigations to be enacted, we have to involve stakeholders from all across the field. So that means people from the think tank space, that means people from the industry space, that means people from the policymaker space, et cetera. Another one of our key guiding principles is a commitment to accuracy. So we really highlight the focus on ensuring reliable and factual outputs. And this goes to the disinformation challenges, goes to the threats to democracy challenges, but really most importantly, it goes to the importance of ensuring that this technology is usable and beneficial to people in the real world because it allows them to have access to better information with which they can make decisions about their lives and about the world around them. The next guiding principle that we identified as really important was practicable regulation. So this means finding risk mitigations and regulation structures that are not only technically feasible, which is crucially important, but also that we can actually implement not just at a technical level, but at a policy level. So identifying the types of mitigations that are going to actually help us move forward instead of getting stuck in the mud on something that might be impossible here or impossible there. And finally, the last guiding principle that we identified as really important was adaptable and continuous oversight. So structuring into our risk mitigation policy and the mitigation strategies, a part of that is the adaptable and continuous oversight. That is constantly being able to understand how changes in the space, which is so dynamic, can affect our risk mitigations so that we aren't caught off guard down the road as the technology changes. So to jump into the lifecycle framework, the structure of the framework is relatively simple. We simply identified different stages in the life cycle of AI models and determined which mitigations fit most effectively in which parts of the life cycle. And the reason this is important, especially when considering the openness question and the gradient of openness there, is that certain mitigations for certain models that fall in certain places on the openness gradient may or may not be effective. So for models that are really open, the downstream mitigations in the latter stages of the AI lifecycle, for example, model applications or user interactions, are going to be less effective because the groups putting those models together, the labs putting those models together, don't have access to control the models at that point. So regulatory structures to mitigate risk there might not be as effective. So that's why we put for models further along the openness gradient, a big emphasis on upstream mitigation, really targeting the data collection and pre-processing and the architecture of the models as places where effective risk mitigations can be made that then affect the downstream use cases of those models. The lifecycle framework is broken into data collection and pre-processing, model architecture, model training and evaluation, model deployment, model application, user interaction, and again, ongoing monitoring and maintenance. Then in the report, we connect each stage of the framework to the guiding principles, and we show how attacking risk mitigations in this way allows us to actually stick to our guiding principles and come up with the most effective risk mitigations in the long run. Then after the framework is introduced, we go into our deep dive on malicious use risks. And again, as Steve said, this was one of the important categories that we noted in our December report. And malicious use is probably one of the more fleshed out risk categories because we're already seeing a lot of action in that space. As I'm sure other members of the panel will be able to testify to, there are a lot of actively ongoing risks in that space that we need to start working on now. And while some of the other risks associated with AI are more future facing, this is one that we have our hands on as we speak, and we can really look at how the technology is interacting with threat actors, and we can come up with risk mitigations to target those. So we go into a deep dive and examine the historical, present day, and potential future risk cases in fraud, undermining social cohesion and democratic processes, human rights abuses, the disruption of critical infrastructure, and state conflict. And then we apply the framework with everything that we know, and we come up with a list of recommendations for a series of risk mitigations that we feel that work with our framework and apply the guiding principles to risk mitigation as a whole. And finally, to wrap up the report, we take what we've learned from our deep dive and from the learning about the framework, and we introduce the question of openness and that gradient of openness there. And the main thing that we come away with is the reason why the framework is so important, creating those targeted risk mitigations, is because by mitigating risk in this way, we're able to find ways to maintain some of the benefits that are associated with more open access models, such as reduced bias and increased innovation, while utilizing those risk mitigations to tackle some of the downstream problems that may come from those models. So in all, I'm really happy with the work that we've done, and I think we've come up with a great framework to apply risk mitigations. And Mariami, if you'd like to start with some questions.
Yeah, thank you, Louie. For those who want to read the full report, it's been already published, and we put the link in the chat of this webinar. So, of course, we realize that IST is not the only think tank or organization working on these issues, but I believe we are kind of uniquely positioned to have access to the technical expertise through our working group and through other partnerships that we maintain. And I think it's evident on our report. So I encourage you to read it. And also for the audience who is tuning in, if you have questions, please submit it through the Q&A. We will leave around 10 minutes to answer those, but we do have questions that were submitted in advance during the registration process, so we'll address those first. But now to all the panelists, I guess, there's so many global initiatives and activities that aim to address AI safety and security. Globally, there are national level endeavors, but when it comes to enforcing some of those measures, the global community does not seem to be on the same page how exactly to enforce some of the recommendations or regulations or policy mitigation strategies. So what are some of the challenges that you think exist in terms of enforcing and implementing these measures?
I guess I can start. I don't think the sort of challenge that you've highlighted is particularly uncommon, especially for these sort of global governance conversations. We've seen it before, even with something like the Bioweapons Convention, for example. There was some agreement there, but that was because powerful countries didn't want other countries to have access to sort of like cheaper weapons of mass casualty, but that still wasn't binding in some sense. And so I do think, some of the challenges generally are just competing interests, visions for the technology and what it should be used for, the sort of values underpinning the technology's efforts when it's especially kind of framed as a race, these efforts to get ahead. All of these issues, I think, sort of build into the lack of consensus or potentially sort of consensus without sort of enforcement mechanisms. I think that as we continue to evolve on the AI conversation, if countries sort of feel like they're falling behind in this race, they might call for more binding resolutions, even if right now they seem to be opposed to something more binding. But even in, I think, the absence of the kind of enforcement that would be certainly ideal, I do think that there is space for these types of conversations, especially around norm building, shared understandings of terminology. I think all those things are really critical and really important. But of course, it would be great if countries could have some sort of consensus, though I think that would be an exception, certainly, rather than the rule.
Thank you, Valerie. Thanks for the helpful context there and some historical kind of examples. And if others have, Duncan, I see you have some thoughts.
Yeah, following up on that, from a more practical application and standpoint, one of the major challenges I see is just the gap between the high-level resolutions and practical enforcement or even practical deployment for the software developer implementing the models. It's wonderful to have high-level resolutions around openness, trust, alignment like that, but when I'm sitting with my hands on a keyboard, how do I actually implement that? How do we test it? How do we verify it? What are the metrics? What are the specific measurable and actionable deliverables that can be tested and used to verify these types of resolutions and agreements on an international stage? And that's one area where I think we're still not even necessarily playing catch up, but it's still an evolving part of the development conversation and development of AI in general, of what are the right metrics to track. And I think that's one way that the framework is really interesting, is it provides a high-level tool to start addressing some of these questions. But what's most important next is to get down into the specific industry as well as application-based risk mitigations that are something that is practical, that you could hand to someone who is building one of these models and say, implement your fuzz testing against these types of strings or inputs to mitigate risks against these types of attacks. Those are the types of meaningful sorts of actions that I think would move the conversation along from something that is very high level and has a risk of having overregulation or under-regulation.
Thank you, Duncan. I think you have kind of your expertise both as an engineer and now working on AI policy is really, in your opinion, is really, really valuable in this kind of conversations. So, Andre, unless you have thoughts on this, I will move on to the next question, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that when I read your report, actually, and I saw these stages, I thought, this is how actually AI startups should work. So this is basically the model how you should code, you should test your code, and then you should, comply with everything. But I will agree with Duncan, and I also will agree with Valerie that, first of all, we don't have a unanimous community and unanimous thoughts on how it should go. Because, for instance, even between Atlantic Ocean, we have Europe, which has DCA Act, AI Act already implemented. We have United States that still are thinking how it should work and how the legal framework should actually look like. And then we have China and Russia and other actors who actually state control AI, and they actually really control this industry and how it develops. So basically, when we talk about AI development here and compliance differs in every country. And when European countries try to do their compliance, they usually come across difficulties over Atlantic Ocean, because when they want to operate there, they see that there is no compliance here. But when they try to compete with China and other actors, they see that those actors are actually evolving very fast, because government doesn't have any compliance to them. They just have requirements like you should create something very quickly, very effectively for our governmental purposes. It can be military purposes, it can be economic purposes, it can be anything else. So basically, their engineers are not restrained by any kind of moral or legal consequences. So I think this is a big issue. And as Duncan said, we should also focus on industries, because we work with disinformation industry and cybersecurity. And right now, if we take actually in a vacuum, we can see that there is no real life cases on disinformation where people were really liable for what they have spread. If it's not a civil case, like, I don't know, denial of mass shooting or something like that. But still, if you want to express some kind of thoughts and they are lies, but they don't really have any kind of consequences, and it's disinformation, countries still struggle to hold these people accountable, and platforms who spread these things accountable, and as well as platforms that generate this stuff, because usually it's AI generated content, which is actually, you cannot hold accountable people that gave access on commercial basis to people who use their AI to spread disinformation, and there are no real life cases. So until we have real life cases where people are convicted of some crimes, or there are some fines or something like that, there will be no real understanding how to really, work on this frame of moral responsibility when you create something based on AI.
Thank you, Andrea. I think we're all very curious about kind of practical examples that you can share from Ukraine on AI-enabled, AI-powered disinformation, like, information ops. But before we get into that, because our conversation kind of is more about the challenges to implementation, and we are trying to delve into how it can be possible on the technical side, I will just turn my question to Duncan again to delve a bit deeper. In our report, we try to bring forward the recommendations and risk mitigation strategies informed by technologists and subject matter experts, as I mentioned earlier. But considering your expertise and extensive background in kind of safety, critical systems, and AI safety, I was wondering, what do you see as primary risks associated with AI technologies in the operational decision-making? And how do you think generally these risks are perceived from the engineering perspective? Because we talk about, other actors a lot, but what about people who actually build these systems?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I might turn it on its head a little bit in terms of just because it ends up being a fairly broad question that depends on the application. And AI is a very broadly defined term in and of itself for math and statistics applied to operational decision making in a large sense. And given the range of industries and systems that it can cover, there's a whole wide spectrum of what that could result in. If you've flown on a plane since 2018, you've been protected by a system called ACAS-X that was first developed in the United States at Lincoln Laboratory, adopted by the FAA, and eventually became a world standard for mid-air aircraft collision avoidance. That is an AI-based system that is incredibly successful, has rigorous testing gone into it, proofs, verifications around its behavior, and is incredibly, incredibly robust by development through the effort of many, many engineers and people over multiple years. One of the main challenges, though, with AI systems is the difference between extrapolation and interpolation. AI in general is very good at interpolating, so based off of what data it has seen before and been trained on, it can very reliably, if trained properly, figure out similar outputs. In a way, we see this with text generation, we see this with generative images, we see this with predictions for flying aircraft. Extrapolation is where you get into trouble in most operational decision-making. When you are in a new scenario that you have never encountered before, how do you deal with those scenarios? Out here in the Bay Area, I can see it on a fairly regular basis with self-driving car tests where you can see one driving down the road and suddenly you have a pedestrian on a scooter wearing a dinosaur outfit and the car goes, I have never seen this before. What do I do? That is a good extrapolation case where a person could reason about that extrapolation fairly quickly. For software and systems, that's a much harder thing to deal with. So as a practitioner, generally the way I've found most effective approaching it is you really need to work with your security experts, your security team, as well as apply good decision frameworks for risk mitigation of understanding what the problem you're trying to solve. What are the chances for being in an extrapolation scenario versus an interpolation scenario? When are you going to put your system into new and unforeseen environments where it might not have encountered them before? And those are the types of environments that you need to then start applying risk mitigation frameworks in a systematic manner to start addressing them. This is particularly challenging, especially in some of the cases that Andre mentioned, for generative AI, because that's putting these tools in the hands of humanity, where we can think up of all sorts of new use cases and applications where it's much harder for an individual developer to think through them. So that ends up being one of the hardest challenges, where more constrained systems, aircraft, vehicles, cars, automotives, that actually ends up being easier in many regards, though not necessarily easy.
Well, thank you for that. Someone who is a social scientist, delving into those details is especially interesting for me. And I love working on AI security policy precisely because of that fact, because, we can connect policymakers to the kind of technical expertise. And so I can go and let you talk about that forever. But going back to Andre, because we've been kind of playing around this topic of AI enabled cyber and information ops, I would be very, very curious to, Andre, if you could share some of your insights and maybe examples that you have encountered as someone who is in the front line of receiving AI-enabled information attacks and disinformation operations from Russia.
So yeah, basically we have like many examples of how they work. But I would like to say that Ukraine, before full-scale invasion, developed as every country, like every European country. So we had a lot of people in e-commerce that developed AI on commercial basis for marketing purposes, for other purposes. So, and when Ukraine faced full-scale invasion, we didn't expect that actually Russians will use AI to spread disinformation at scale, like bots. So usually it's coordinated in authentic behavior, which is bots or fake accounts or trolls, which have actually developed themselves from very primitive, level where they could just not translate even their thoughts into Ukrainian. Now they speak Ukrainian and even evaluate opinions of people on internet and influence this opinion. And also they interact within themselves, so creating this unique CIB network where bots and AI actually interacts with one another, creating such a picture where you think that this is a real people discussing some kind of political topic, and you really rely for that and you fall for that. So, and Ukraine actually faced this really big challenge because government didn't have any program back then to actually enable those people to, create something to withstand this Russian attack. So we and other companies, we came from private sector, and we were driven by rules of European law. Right now we have this white paper for AI in Ukraine, where everybody who tries to develop their AI should stick to the European Union laws and actually comply with this white paper if they want. Of course, they try to create this AI software that will be compliant and will not violate basic human rights or privacy rights or any kind of that stuff. But still, on the other hand, we have this task to, because AI is implemented in different spheres. Of course, first one is military right now, because drones and other stuff that should operate on AI should be developed more quickly. So the number one goal for Russians and for Ukrainians, and I guess for Chinese and for everyone right now is, as in your report said, for instance, it's self-driven drones that can actually complete their tasks when they have been, interrupted by some radio location stuff. So if you cannot operate with drone and cannot hit your target, then you should the drone should complete the task by themselves using AI. So basically, everybody is developing this stuff, and the Russians in disinformation sphere, which is cognitive war, they have developed this huge amount of techniques where they can actually use not only bots, but messengers, Telegram channels, for instance, to spread disinformation very quickly and do it in several waves. So basically, they start in their own country, they see the reaction to the message or to the information in their own country, then they experiment in Ukraine, whether this information is good or not, and then they spread this at scale in different languages through their network in France, Germany, all over the world. So basically, AI helps them generate narratives at scale in different languages, and their models were trained on a governmental basis. So basically, if we talk about Ukraine, Ukraine is more like from down to like from the bottom to up, basically model, where we have this private initiative where we reach the government, we try to comply with everything and try to fight disinformation and malicious actors. Whereas Russia is more like, that like up to bottom. So basically, they have governmental program for AI development up to 2035, I guess. So they have this big ambition to actually train their models with big giants like Mail.ru, Yandex, which is like a search engine with huge set of data. And also they have telecom providers that give them data as well to train their models, which actually begets a big problem for everyone, because their technicians and their AI specialists can go to these corporations, and we don't know really what they are talking about with those guys, because they are not regulated by any regulation, like European regulation or any kind of other regulation. And if government wants to experiment and train their model on private data, which is basically forbidden, I guess they can do this, and they do this, and their models become more sophisticated when we see it. Sometimes we see when how they work, like having new tactics. So they basically trying to be more human-like models, train human-like models. Also, they know they right now use it in scams. Basically, they the last thing that was targeting Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and also Russia is when somebody used a voice of a person from Telegram. So basically, when you text to someone in Telegram, you can leave a voice message. Somebody broke your Telegram, could use your voice and talk to your relatives, like scamming money from your relatives. So this is the last model that actually was launched in post-USSR countries. So and Russia was also involved in this. We don't know who actually was a real beneficiary of this scheme, but this is how this model is trained. So basically, Telegram was, I guess, affected by that. So it was like some of the messengers were broken, and people were receiving messages in Telegram with voice messages like give me money, I'm your friend, so by blah blah blah, and people really fall for that, and this scheme is just aggravating all the stuff, so all the time. So basically, just to be short, Russia has its own structure and policy which helps them to experiment more, and because they are not restrained by anything, they can expand better and quicker. Whereas Ukraine, even though we also catch up with them, we have to restrain with we have to actually comply with European Union recommendations, and of course with white papers. And sometimes it calls for a drag in in development, but still it actually helps us to be compliant. Yeah, but we are still effective, I would say.
Well, thank you, Andre. This was a very useful context and also a kind of perfect way to ask the next question. And it's a big question to Valerie, which consists of like the several sub questions. So bear with me. As we know, 2024 is a massive year for elections, with almost half of the world's population electing their next government. So, and of course, the AI-enabled disinformation campaigns have surfaced, and it has been discussed. And from my observation, there are basically kind of two camps who, based on how they perceive those threats, and it's quite different. For instance, recently there was this article published in Foreign Affairs by the top cyber and disinformation experts. The title of the paper is "Don't Hype the Disinformation Threat," and they argued that the online campaigns don't have the online information ops don't have power unless we give them the power. So that was kind of a main gist of the article. So I'm very curious on what's your take on this, and how do you see AI tools being used in terms of spreading misinformation, especially during the elections? And what kind of measures or mitigation strategies do you think can be most effective in safeguarding the democratic processes against AI-driven disinformation campaigns? And after you share your insights, I would then love to hear Louie's kind of thoughts based on the report that we published. What are some of the strategies that we propose to offset the risks associated with what we call undermining the social cohesion?
Okay. So I think, to kind of start with your question about this debate, there's really, I think, two pieces worth touching on. One is really in thinking about the persuasiveness and scope of disinformation broadly. And then the second is the generative AI element and its role in framing these debates. I think in both cases, for both issues, it's really important to level set the challenges. So I do think that Foreign Affairs article is in some sense a level setter. On the disinformation side broadly, there's really, really good academic research that has found both the spread of false content and its impacts to be not statistically significant, really, when small, and also not statistically significant when compared to the broader information ecosystem. I think the Foreign Affairs article talks about undermining institutions and trust, voter agency in being able to make informed choices. There is also an element of we don't want to call everything a disinformation campaign, because we do have broader social cohesion challenges. And so when a disinformation campaign does show up, and they certainly do, to carry that weight and not just have everything be kind of brushed aside as, oh, another disinformation campaign. However, I do also think it's really, really important to recognize that this sort of broader information space, and this has been a challenge across a lot of this research, which really picked up, I think, in the late 2010s. But it's a really hard space to measure well, particularly the idea of sort of repeated exposure over time to algorithmic systems, whether it's a disinformation campaign combined with something more targeted too. And it's also important that we're not actually looking at the average change in user beliefs, the sort of statistically significant change. And there was another article, I believe it was in Nature, that looked at, actually, we're looking at the polls. We want to look at the edge of the spectrum, because you don't actually need a lot of people to be moved in their beliefs or in their motivations to cause offline harms. And so I think that it's really critical to recognize that, but of course makes things much, much harder to measure, and in some sense would be a null finding from an academic publication perspective. From the governance side, I think the article does make really good points about governance, especially in terms of giving authoritarian regimes sort of free rein and being able to crack down on speech they don't like. So I think that that's really critical. But it's certainly, I think there's a delicate balance happening. And we're certainly seeing these types of campaigns. Some of them are not effective. There's a lot of sort of spaghetti being thrown at the wall, but it is definitely in some sense with the intent to further drive wedges, even if those wedges do already exist and are part of a broader social cohesion challenge. In terms of the elections and experimentation, we've seen experimentation, but not, I think, wholesale adoption. So some of my own research looked at that, found it was sort of a small fraction of the contested information space. There was a report by OpenAI, and I believe Microsoft had one as well, that looked at how foreign actors were experimenting with these tools. It's as everybody predicted, right? It's to debug code, generate script, create content for phishing campaigns, correct grammar, do translations, things like that. But it's clunky. They include things still like sure, I will separate those into unique tags as the unique tags, or don't necessarily get rid of some of the AI generated tells. So I do think that that's important. And noticeably, they also don't find that it has kind of a wide reach. But there are ways that AI is impacting elections and broader discourse just by existing in the world as a possibility, right? So in some sense, it allows people to deny an inconvenient truth or harmful content as AI-generated disinformation. And we saw this a bit in Argentina. We think, we're not sure, right? It's still unclear what exactly happened. But, by broadly existing as a possibility, without ever being used necessarily, it does undermine the information space. Also, national level contests do hinge on really local contests, and there's a lot less attention on those local contests. So I do think, a deep fake at the local level targeting a candidate may not get the same media level attention as the Joe Biden robocall did, but it can be very, very harmful. And so I do think that those are areas to be thinking about. And then I think to your last question, when thinking about kind of the mitigation and regulatory strategies and the like, we're floundering in the US quite a bit. We've seen some enforcement from existing agencies. We've seen competition now between the FCC and the FEC over who controls elections and AI-generated content around elections. So we'll see how that plays out. We've seen Congress talk a lot about AI-generated content and the recognition that there is a lot of bipartisan concern. There was a little bit of movement recently in the Senate, but we'll see how that plays out. And so I think, in the absence of this, we've really left it in the hands of tech companies who have been somewhat going it alone to mitigate these risks. And of course, there are challenges there with respect to self-governance versus competition, where that balance plays out when companies who are trying to lead this space are also trying to, be responsible actors or create the appearance of being responsible actors working together. And so there's been a bit of collaboration around AI deepfake, some stuff around content provenance, sort of these nutrition labels around generated content, developer built-in guardrails, but these are kind of funny and a little bit squishy. So we had an exercise at Brookings actually, where people were generating images, and they tried to generate an image, generate an image of Justin Trudeau. And the model wouldn't do it. The image generator wouldn't do it. But if you said generate an image of the president of Canada, it would do that. And it looked strikingly like Justin Trudeau, even though it rejected using the name. And so a lot of these safeguards, I think they're well intentioned, but there are certainly ways to get around them. The one thing I do think is, well, two things I'd say are very promising. Some products we're seeing that I think could be really, really harmful in an election content. A lot of the, especially really high quality voice cloning tools, and I saw a new one actually announced today, are being held back for a bit or just used at the moment for research purposes. I think that's really, really important to not release those publicly right now, especially because, we don't really have a grasp on how to govern them appropriately. And then I do think these transparency reports, thinking about especially the usage of AI tools, how they're being used in the broader information space. Of course, it would be wonderful for researchers, external researchers, and I hope that this does happen, to have more data access and to be able to get further insights into what's going on in some of these companies. But I do think some of the transparency reporting we're seeing about usage, how it's being experimented, things like that are really important too.
Yeah, I'd love to tag on to that, because I think Valerie, you made a lot of good points there, and those considerations worked into our report. And one of the risk mitigations that we proposed, first of all, is to utilize existing legal measures. A lot of the space is rightfully concerned about finding new ways to mitigate risks, finding ways to tackle these familiar but changing problem sets. And one of the reminders that we think is really important is utilize existing legal structures. Make sure that when you have someone using AI to commit a crime or to spread, legally punishable misinformation or disinformation, then you use existing legal structures. It's election interference to lie to people about when their voting date is, and to tell them to go to the polls on a day after voting day. So we need to use existing legal structures and give the companies that, Valerie, like you were saying, are working on building novel solutions a little bit of time to breathe and to engineer the solutions to these problems. And that's another thing that came into far on the downstream side of our life cycle framework in ongoing monitoring and maintenance. And this is really why it's so important. As you were saying, there's a lot of questions that researchers need more information to make intelligent, informed decisions and recommendations on how this information or disinformation is affecting our social cohesion and our democratic processes. And that's why we recommend that regulators and public figures establish public campaigns to help individuals report and to create accessible reporting mechanisms to help identify and address misuse as it's happening, so that the regulatory and risk mitigation community can actually have the best amount of information possible to see how these AI systems are being utilized in real time, and then come up with risk mitigations that really target those specific parts of those models that are causing problems. And that's, again, that's one of the strengths of this framework, is it's adaptable in the sense that as we identify certain risk categories or changing risk categories or manifestations of those risks, we can actually plot them out on the life cycle and say, this is what's happening, this is where our problem is, where in the life cycle is the most effective place to fix it, instead of standing there with a risk and saying we need to start all the way at the top and mitigate this all the way down, and go for tight controls. Because especially when we're talking about the open access question, that doesn't work quite as well. I know we have a Q&A, so I think, Mariami, would you like to lead that off?
Yeah, so I think the remaining time, thank you, Louie. And so we have these risk mitigation strategies and kind of our recommendations, not only on the undermining of social cohesion kind of category, but all the other categories such as AI-enabled cyber operations and state conflict and so on and so forth. So you can check that out in our report. But remaining time, I think we can answer one question that popped up during the Q&A, which is actually about our previous report, which was about how does access impact risk. The question is about what markers or examples were used to create these categories. Because there were 6 categories of AI risk, and then there were color-coded as relatively low risk, low medium risk, and so on. And the question is about how did we come up with this framing? What is medium risk and what is medium high risk, for instance? I don't know if Louie and Steve, you have insights on this. From my understanding, this were kind of co-created during the working group meetings, and the write-up of this report was a kind of a product of working group members' insights, plus our researchers at ISD.
Yeah, Mariami, I'm happy to jump in, and I won't over-explain this because in the case of AI research, there's not a lot of literature in some cases to review back to. So as the working group was trying to map the impact of different levels of openness from fully closed to fully open with some levels in between, like API access, et cetera, how was a particular risk impacted by that? And it was kind of the collective judgment of the group, to the extent that there are categories of risk where there was some good literature review and examples of bad things happening, then the research kind of tethered back to that. But in other cases, it was just the kind of consensus best judgment of the group as to how those mapped out. Not a perfect answer, but at the time that was as close as we could get.
Thank you, Steve. So this is, I guess we are at time. I want to thank all of our speakers for finding the time in their very busy schedules to join us and answer our questions. And I would like to, if Steve has additional kind of closing remarks, the way forward, a few words about our future activities, Steve, and then we can close up.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mariami, for hosting such an excellent panel discussion. Thank you, Andre, Duncan, Valerie, and Louie for all your fantastic work writing this report up. I feel like we barely scratched the surface, so I do encourage everyone to actually read the report. We are interested in your reactions to the approach, the principles, the lifecycle approach, the mitigations that we offer, kind of where in the life cycle those can be applied. But what is the future? What are the things we're going to do next? This report did a deep dive in one of the 6 categories of risks identified in that original December 2023 report, malicious use. You'll notice that there are a number of subcategories of malicious use. We touched on a number of those here. Well, it is our intention to go to the next one. So we will continue to work on this, and we anticipate that this batch of work could possibly even turn into, instead of a series of paper products, could be actually an online resource as we continue to fill in and go risk by risk, come up with mitigation strategies, and then over time we can adjust those. So that's our idea, is just to keep extending on this work and make it as useful as possible to practitioners and policymakers alike. So I'd like also to thank a couple of acknowledgements. This work could not have been done but for the contributions of our stakeholders across industry, academia, and civil society. And so we have a working group that was with us for the writing of the first report and with this one as well. And in specific, Chloe Autio, Vaishnavi J, Jeffrey Laddish, and Chloe Autio were named, and Zoe Brahmer were named contributors on this particular report. Thank you for your help. And a number of other members for different reasons would not be named by name, but certainly were contributing behind the scenes. And then we are also immensely grateful for the generous support of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, whose funding allowed IST to continue this project through the lens of our Applied Trust and Safety Program, and Google.org, whose funding supports IST's AI in cybersecurity work. So we look forward to future products. We do have a project going on right now on specifically implications of AI in cybersecurity, so future publication there. And we would very much welcome others' involvement in our multi-stakeholder efforts.